On episode 701 of the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, we meet Dr. Katherine Reid and discuss her book, Fat, Stressed, and Sick: MSG, Processed Food, and America's Health Crisis. Welcome to the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast, the largest and longest running health and fitness podcast dedicated to people over 40. Whether you're looking to lose weight, get stronger, or improve your health and age better, this podcast is for you. I'm your host, Coach Allan, an online health and fitness coach and author of The Wellness Roadmap. Each week, we dive into practical tips, expert advice, and inspiring stories to help you take control of your health and fitness. If you're ready to look, feel, and perform your best, no matter your age, this podcast is the perfect place to start. Let's get you on the path to a healthier, fitter, and more energetic version of yourself. I hope you'll join us each week, and together we can unlock your full potential. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the 40 Plus Fitness Podcast. I'm really glad you're here today. Can you believe it's the first day of July? Oh my goodness. This is going live on the first day of July, and it is kind of crazy that this year is halfway over already. But it's also, we're leading into some of the hottest time of the year, particularly here in North America. So I just want to remind people that this is the time to really watch out for your health and fitness. We do want to get out more and enjoy this weather, except that it does get really, really hot. And so understanding heat and understanding how your body responds to heat is really, really important. Don't let yourself get too hot. Don't let yourself get exposed to too much sun. And if you're going to use a sunscreen, use one that isn't chemically laden and causes more problems than it's worth. So make sure you're taking care of yourself this summer, particularly in the hot weather. Drink plenty of fluids, keep your temperature down. Don't try to overdo it. If you're going to exercise outside, try to do that in the morning or in the later evening when it's not so hot. But just remember that heat can be a very dangerous thing, particularly as we get over 40 and we're out and about. So stay hydrated, stay happy, and enjoy your summer. So let's move on, and we'll talk to Dr. Katherine Reid. Our guest today is a biochemist and the founder of Unblind My Mind, Inc., a nonprofit 501c3 organization dedicated to improving health through informed food choices. Previously, she worked in the Silicon Valley biotech industry in the development of cancer pharmaceuticals and diagnostics. Today, she works with individuals and families in collaboration with medical and biotech communities to devise data-driven food solutions for chronic inflammatory illnesses. With no further ado, here's Dr. Katherine Reid. Dr. Reid, welcome to 40 Plus Fitness.
Thank you for having me.
You know, I'm excited to talk about this book for a number of reasons. The first one was the title, which is Fat, Stressed, and Sick: MSG, Processed Food, and the American Health Crisis. And I don't think you can walk outside in the United States anywhere and not realize there's a significant problem going on right now. We are fat, stressed, and sick, and like no other time. It's really hard to sit back and think about how things were. You see pictures, and you're like, yeah, that's how it was. Everybody's like, no, it couldn't have been like that. It had to be more. No, it was not like this.
Yes, no, and sometimes I get a little bit of a glance when I speak about the title, Fat, Stressed, and Sick, and they're like, why so, you know,
Yeah.
what's obnoxious? But I'm like, I really want to bring attention to that we're normalizing the plus sizes and the increased weight that's going on. And it is normal because now we've got the majority of our population in this category of obese or overweight. And it's normal, but it's not healthy. And, really trying to bring attention to that you can't be obese and healthy. Those two don't go together. And what can we do about it? And it's not at all about shaming anybody where they're at. It's just saying we can do things about it and empower ourselves. And that's definitely one of the purposes of the book, Fat, Stressed, and Sick, MSG Processed Food in America's Health Crisis, is that we do have a crisis. And we have ownership that, certainly big food is not taking ownership. So we as individuals need to take ownership of what we're putting into our mouths.
Yeah. Now I have two core observations about this book. I wanted to narrow it down to one, but I couldn't do it. So I have two
Okay.
for this particular book. One is, they talk about the power of a woman scorned, and I'll take it and say, well, if she's a mother scorned, it's like multiply that by 1,000. So a mother scorned is just not something to mess with. And then when she's a biochemist, only good can can come out of that, because
Watch out.
she's gonna she's gonna tear all this stuff apart, and she's gonna figure out how all of it works, because she has to solve this problem. And as a mother, there's nothing that's going to get between her and solving this problem. And you did so much work, and then actually took all that and turned it into something beautiful, because now we can learn at a level I don't think we would have been able to learn if it wasn't someone just like you doing this.
And isn't that how most awareness comes, is through suffering, that we start to, figure out a path out of the suffering? And for sure, that was definitely my story, is, my youngest being diagnosed with autism. I really wasn't finding a lot of help and support in the medical journey part of it. In fact, a lot of dismissing and, really not much they can do about it. Your child's going to be special needs for the rest of their lives, not really a lot of hope and empowerment. And so it really was my journey diving, and I mean diving deep into the foods, that I really came across this link with the glutamate and the glutamate industry, and how it's being hidden in our food supply, and how that really is contributing to our chronic inflammatory load in our society, not just America, but in modern societies, and really trying to bring awareness, because this awareness for me was a game changer, absolute game changer. And just hoping to bring that kind of awareness to other people, where they're like, wow, I can live a better quality of life despite this medical diagnosis. And that's empowering.
Yeah. And now the other observation I have is maybe just a little less kind. It's a little bit more of a rant. I guess I just don't get it. I can understand. Okay, so because you're not the only biochemist out there in this field that studies food. Basically, you made yourself into a food scientist because of necessity. But there are food scientists out there that their job is to understand what's going on in the body when we're eating this food. And I can kind of get it if you're if you're the guy who's going to make seven figures by getting people to open that second can of Pringles, then that's your job and that's what you're making your money to do, and you're going to do that. But when someone actually works for the government, they took the government job to protect people, and then they don't. I don't know where that comes from. I just that's what I can't wrap my mind around, is we have an organization in our government that focuses on safety and food. And you've taken studies that have existed since the 1930s. That's how deep you dived. And we've known that this was a problem. And I know we've known this because we would be told, okay, don't go to the Chinese restaurant too often because they use the MSG, and you don't really want a whole lot of that in your diet. An occasional bit of it is probably okay, but it's not something you want to be eating all the time. So we know don't go to the Chinese restaurant every week because that's just not going to work out. But now they're figuring out ways to get it into our food without even having to add it. They're figuring out ways in their processing where it's just a naturally occurring thing, or they're calling it other things. Like I'm sitting here reading your book and I've got this cheese and I'm gonna go get a piece of cheese, and then you start talking about different things and I'm like, I look at the label and I'm like, cultures, added flavors, like, natural flavors. And I'm like, you know, it's right here. And I would have never known it. And there are people in the government that's their job to make sure we aren't poisoning ourselves. And you can
Yeah,
look around and see
and
obviously they're not doing their job.
yeah, I've worked with a lot of FDA regulators in my biotech, career, and spoke with them as we're trying to get drugs approved and um, medical diagnostic, equipment. So, I've worked with them and see the process of review and going through data and such. And where I think we have an issue here is the corporate sponsored studies that can be very difficult and challenging for a regulator to kind of really dive deep there. They don't have the time. We don't have and certainly right now, the FDA regulators being able to have the time to really dive deep. So we're not just talking about food, we're talking about big pharma, we're talking about, there's a lot of industries there. I mean, just look at the whole tobacco obfuscation, where we've got massive, massive dollars of these companies sponsoring their own studies. And the way they design these studies can, fool the best of scientists. And that's where it's very challenging here because you're like, unless you're doing the science yourself and you've got the controls there, you know exactly what they did with the placebo, going in there and diving the raw data and doing the analysis, it's not easy. So, I'm not at all saying, FDA regulators failed at their job there. I do think that we have a system issue where we've got too many corporate sponsored studies advocating for their own product. And it should not be that way. We should not have corporate sponsored studies for any, drugs or whatnot. We should have independent groups running these studies and that the funding comes from either the people, the government, or whatnot, so that it's truly, getting to more of the unbiased. And we don't have that in our systems right now with a lot of how science studies are conducted.
Yeah, but the science is there. You found the science. It's already there. And so this is just a function of getting on your computer in many cases, downloading what was 540-page book, uh, and other studies that they're there, that they say,
Yeah.
okay, this is the disease pathway, and this is how it works. Well, yeah, let's throw more of this stuff into our body when we know that's the addiction pathway in our brain. Let's do that
But yeah.
because
And you have
what could go wrong?
The International Glutamate Technical Committee, a multi-billion, potentially trillion-dollar industry where big food, is giving them money to keep their vested interest of glutamate being considered safe. And so the studies that they put out far outnumber the studies that I come up with to say, no, there is another story here and there is, another side. Um, what was interesting is that much of my studies were looking at a lot of pharmaceutical or drug companies that were making glutamate blocker drugs. Well, why would you need glutamate blocker drugs for everything from Alzheimer's and Parkinson's to cancer and autism? Why would you need glutamate blocker drugs? What's contributing to the massive overload in glutamate, or needing to regulate glutamate better? And so that's where I'm getting a lot of my like, wow, look at the effects of glutamate here. And so it was interesting that I couldn't find a lot of what I was looking for in human glutamate studies. I mean, there were some that I obviously have there in population studies and such, but those are far and few compared to the pharmaceutical companies that were trying to get glutamate blocker drugs approved.
block them so we can eat more.
Exactly.
Sorry. Okay, that was my rant.
Right.
That
Well,
was my
look at
rant.
diabetes, right? Let's look at something that's going to regulate glucose so that we can have refined sugars, And so, it's not just obviously the processed proteins that contribute an issue, but there's a lack of awareness, which is why I wanted to write the book and speak and get out there and advocate for MSG
Well,
is not something
and like I
that's
said, I appreciate it. That's why I'm really glad to have you on here because we're gonna explain some of this because I do have to admit even for myself as I kind of got into it I'm like okay because I was talking to my wife and I said the word glutamate and she says oh well that's that stuff for your knees. I'm like no it's not that stuff for your knees. But it's easy to get confused because there are multi-syllable words and there's a lot of science behind each of them and what they are. So let's just slow down a little bit and say what is glutamate and what forms does it come in, and then finally, well, why would it be a problem for us
yeah. So
to eat
glutamate is
something
an
like that?
okay. Glutamate is an amino acid, which is the building block of proteins. So obviously we eat proteins, and then we've got proteins that we're making in our bodies, and so an amino acid is the building block of proteins. So I talk in the book about glutamate bound in a protein by peptide bonds is considered bound glutamate versus free glutamate, which is in our food. The most common form of free glutamate is monosodium glutamate because sodium is the most common ion in our food. So monosodium glutamate, distinguishing that from glutamate or glutamic acid in a protein. And that's my, studies as I'm a protein chemist by training. And so I was, well kind of positioned to be diving deep into this whole issue with processing of proteins. And, like you mentioned before, what's happening is our ultra processed foods that we in America are consuming, high majority, over 60% of our intake in our diet is ultra processed foods. If you've got protein in there, you're ultra processing that protein and obliterating it, breaking those peptide bonds and freeing the amino acids, of which glutamate is a predominant common amino acid. So why would that be an issue of having too much of this free amino acid, free glutamate? Is it is a neurotransmitter, so it has the ability to excite our nervous system. And I don't mean excited like, oh man, this is joyful, but it's bringing this like fight, flight, fear, fawn neurological response in our system. And you think about anxiety, depression, ADHD, and this excitation creates such an energy imbalance where it's dysregulating our glucose and it's requiring a lot of energy to keep that excited nervous system up. So it creates quite the energy imbalance. And then we've got, metabolic syndrome and diabetes and obesity kind of hitting those energy imbalance, diseases or disorders. And so the glutamate ends up being a common key to unlock a bunch of cell receptors by glutamate receptors being on a variety of different cells. So it's regulating leptin and insulin and, all sorts of different metabolic functions, different neurotransmitters, the glutamate GABA balance. And so you find yourself, if you've got an excess of glutamate, it can have a whole host of symptoms affecting you, all the way down to cancer. Like, I mean, it can certainly whack out your metabolism of your cell. And we've got glutamate blocker drugs now being prescribed for a variety of different cancers. And so it's very deleterious to have this glutamate dysregulation going on, yet we've got a ton of it going on in our food.
Yeah, there was a stat. I'm gonna get it wrong because it's big numbers, but it was like 13 back in like 1971 or something. It was like 13,000 metric tons of monosodium glutamate was manufactured for food products. So basically available in our food products as MSG. But now we're what was it 3 million, 30 million metric
Yeah,
tons
3.3 million metric tons. And
versus
would I want to,
13,000.
yeah, Well, and that is only representing 10% of the free glutamate in our food supply because the 90% is coming from the processing of protein. So you can take something like a whole food, let's just say almonds, for example, and you subject it to a bunch of acid and ferment the heck out of it and let it age in high pressure and temperature, and you're going to break apart the peptide bonds in that protein, and you're going to get a bunch of free amino acids, including glutamate. And that's what's going on in our food supply with the hydrolyzed proteins and the whey protein isolates and all these things going on in our food supply. It's 90%. So that's on top of that 3.3 million metric tons of MSG produced as MSG, pure MSG. It's labeled as MSG in our food supply. 90% of it's not labeled.
Yeah. And and we can say it's in the label, but I mean you talked about something like going to a restaurant and ordering something and it had paprika in it. It was paprika. And so you're like, okay, well, bring me the thing of paprika. And basically it was MSG with some paprika for coloring, for lack of a better anything.
Yeah.
So so they're putting MSG in the food, and then the way that some of the processing's happening, it's freeing up more glutamate. And you even said something as simple as like you were trying to get to a point of unprocessed food, so you wanted uncured ham, and it was just salt and ham on the ingredient label, but depending on how long it sat in the salt and the temperature, it could have started a general process of releasing more glutamate.
Right. These, various rubs that they're putting on the meat and storing it at, room temperature and letting it ferment, creating that, savory glutamate flavor. Yes.
And so that's another thing. So this is the umami flavor that we all kind of really like and are drawn toward, and in a sense, can't get enough of.
Right. And if you think about, just the similar to sugars, the more that you're stimulating that taste receptor on our tongue, and, I talk about this a lot with like, glucose sugars, glutamate, the umami, overstimulated to the detriment of like the sour and the bitters that should be coming from like vegetables or herbs and such. You're overstimulating taste receptors that are literally neurologically wiring your body to prefer, to seek those, to keep that continued overstimulation going. And it literally neurologically wires your body for a preference, a taste preference that becomes, less and less nutritious, less and less healthy. And I often describe when we rethink food, it really is neurologically rewiring our bodies to get a lot of the taste receptors activated on our tongues so that we're stimulating and getting pleasure from the sours and the bitters, not from like sour gummies, but, the
Yeah.
actual like bitter foods, mustard greens and such. And really finding that that's how we've evolved, is not just keep overstimulating some of these glucose glutamate receptors from the processed foods.
Yeah. And now amino acids are important because they're a building block of everything in our body. So we do need protein as a source that we eat. And there are amino acids that are essential for us to eat. We call them essential amino acids because we have to eat them. This is not one of those. Our body produces all of the glutamate it actually needs. We don't have to eat additional glutamate. So it's not like we're missing it. So from a supplement perspective, there's no positive reason for you to need more glutamate in your diet.
Correct. And I mean, the most common supplement that I'm seeing, for example, for gastrointestinal issues, leaky gut, which is kind of like this new fad buzzword, is glutamine. And I talk about that in the book too, is that glutamine can be converted to glutamate with our microbes, and the enzymes that the microbes are producing. And so that glutamine can actually cause this excitatory effect when you're consuming it like a free amino acid also. And so ideally, we're consuming proteins in their whole food form. They've got the peptide bonds, And that way, if you think about the whole digestive tract, you're not getting a bunch of free amino acids hitting your esophageal, receptors or your stomach. We're looking for the bulk to hit the small intestine, where the pancreas is then secreting enzymes and we're digesting those proteins as we need the amino acids to be transported across the intestinal barrier or the intestinal wall and into our blood. And then from there, they can use and build proteins that we are then functioning in our body as a variety of different proteins. So to consume all these free amino acids is messing with our amino acid transports and messing with the digestion system and such like that too. So even essential amino acid is typically best consumed through whole food proteins that are then being regulated with the amino acid transport, mechanisms.
Yeah. And so and probably where the most dangerous aspects of all this comes in is that typically there's a blood brain barrier that's going to keep the what's in the blood that doesn't need to be in the brain out of the brain, but a lot of this glutamate can get around that blood brain barrier. And the reason that that's such a huge deal is that glutamate is a neurotransmitter that literally is one cell talking to another cell. It's releasing glutamate as a function of doing that, and that's part of that communication. And now we're just throwing a lot of whatever into the mix. That's it sounds terrible.
Yeah, I mean, and that's been, quite the statement from the glutamate industry is that this doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. There's no ill effects of this. And, that's just debunked in so many ways the more that we're learning about the whole microbiome element and the gut-brain connection, which there's a whole bunch of signaling going from the gut all the way to the brain, which then affects the metabolism of the brain. If the brain perceives that there's an injury, for example, in the heart or the gut, it will alter its metabolism so that it is then distributing a bunch of different help, to various areas of the body. So that whole, doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier myth goes out the window right there when we're talking about, okay, neurotransmitters, or signaling can cross into the brain from various regions of the body. And then there's always times in our life that we have a weakened blood-brain barrier when we're extra fatigued, when women are pregnant, neonatal or infants. When you're sick, when you're inflamed, our blood-brain barrier may become weakened, where then it is crossing from the blood. And it's interesting when I kind of really dove into the whole glutamate metabolism. Like if somebody ends up having like a head injury, or let's say less severe, like a headache, the inflammation is typically from increased glutamate production going on in the brain to signal stress responses and such. And that obviously will then cascade throughout the body, where the energy is becoming zapped because of dealing with this massive glutamate release to help with this, stress response.
And so we're artificially affecting a stress response and our body's going to respond.
Exactly. And that's where I always kind of, make the analogy of this fight, flight, fear, fawn kind of, response that we see so many people trapped and, really living the majority of their lives in. Well, we're exacerbating that by some of the foods that we're eating. And glutamate really is evolutionarily conserved at higher levels. It is a stress response.
Okay. So you talked about addiction, and this was okay. I think we can all agree that they definitely do stuff to the food to make it addictive, because you can't just eat one. Um, and so they put this and probably a lot of other things in the food where it hits us in a certain way from a taste perspective that our brain lights up and says more. And then it also doesn't quite affect it affects our satiety because it's messing with leptin and insulin and all of that. And so then our body's screaming more. Our body actually wants nutrition. It doesn't necessarily want more of that, but It'll take what you give it. Um, and there happens if there is more of that, then you're eating more of that. So we become effectively addicted to food, but this goes beyond just addiction to food. How does this affect
Yeah.
addiction overall?
Yeah, if you think of our bodies, we are a neural network comprised of a bunch of, nerve endings and nerve branches and such. And, glutamate being a neurotransmitter helps with the neural networking of our body. And so glutamate is the underlying mechanism neurologically of any addiction. So, of course, if the food industries are putting this directly into our foods, it is helping us become addicted to that food, even though it could taste, it could be tasteless, void of nutrition. It doesn't matter. Our bodies are going to be addicted to that because it is neurologically wiring that, wow, that was great. Let's have more of that. And even something like alcohol or devices or cocaine, the underlying mechanism that continues to have us seeking that substance we're addicted to is a neurological glutamate signaling. And so when people are going through rehab or trying to withdraw from that addiction, they have to rewire their glutamate neurological signaling. That's what it requires to overcome the addiction,
Okay. And if we
which
have
I find
excess,
fascinating.
yeah, right. That's why I wanted to read that paper until I realized it was a book, cost $33, and it was 540 pages. And I'm like, I don't know when I'm going to be able to read that. So, at any rate, maybe one day. But so if we have excess glutamate in our system, then that just sort of sets us up to fail with addiction.
Yeah, and we can become, and I define addiction as anything that has a negative health outcome, right? Routinely doing your jog in the morning is not going to be an addiction because that's giving you a benefit or improved health outcome. But we can become addicted to our thoughts, our negative thoughts. So a negative thought can induce a stress response internally, right? Not even on the food front internally where it's releasing glutamate, and that's neurologically wiring. And this is how they'll say that people can become addicted to trauma and such like that. But this is the underlying mechanism of the OCD. You become so addicted to the negative thoughts and the patterns, and you keep doing that. And maybe it gives you a little bit of a dopamine or adrenaline rush. And you keep doing those negative thoughts. And so that is a glutamate wiring. But you can imagine consuming a bunch of glutamate in the foods when you're trying to overcome this addiction to these negative thoughts. It becomes a huge uphill battle, right? So, way to stack your castles against you
Yeah.
by having all this glutamate. And same thing with anxiety and such like that. They become neurologically so wired in our bodies that we really have to kind of think about, okay, it's time to neurologically rewire. I need to reset my nervous system, and that is going to be rewiring your whole glutamate map, your glutamate receptor maps.
Okay. Let's dive into obesity and some of the other metabolic diseases, because it's not actually that simple as to just say, okay, because the food's more palatable, we're eating more. There's a lot more in our body going on. Can you kind of talk through that process of how glutamate is affecting our metabolism, affecting insulin, leptin, and whatnot, and how that's leading to obesity and some of these other diseases?
Yeah, and that gets to this whole energy imbalance epidemic that we've got going on. But like I said, the glutamate key being able to unlock a bunch of glutamate receptors that will then have this cellular function, and one of those cells are in the pancreas, the beta islet cells, where the glutamate receptor and the pancreas are releasing insulin. So glutamate is helping with the regulation of insulin because it is part of how we balance energy. So you think about insulin resistance, that can start to happen when you really are eating a bunch of glutamate, but there's not a lot of glucose potentially going on in your blood, or maybe there is a bunch of glucose, but it starts to, you know, swamp these insulin receptors, such that then the cells are no longer responding appropriately to insulin with respect to need for calories or glucose needing to get into the cells, the insulin resistance. And what I found fascinating is that, we often associate type 1 diabetes with an autoimmune condition not related to foods. And I think that's a complete myth. If you look at the first antibodies that are starting to be formed in pre-type 1 diabetic patients, it's to the GAD65 protein, the glutamate decarboxylase enzyme. So obviously that glutamate decarboxylase enzyme is upregulated when it's exposed to a bunch of glutamate. And then we're having antibodies formed to that, so our body's trying to figure out how to regulate what's going on there. And that is the first set of antibodies that are typically identified in type 1 diabetes. And then they start to form to the beta cells in the pancreas. And so that is related to the foods. That is something that can potentially have a lot of preventative. Now, is there a genetic predisposition? Definitely possible there, but there's also some environmental predispositions too. And then type 2 diabetes with the whole insulin resistance, that is completely because our body is no longer responding appropriately to the insulin levels because the insulin levels are just whacked out and not responding to food appropriately. And again, glutamate is binding to these receptors and causing that insulin resistance. And you think about type 3 diabetes that we now call Alzheimer's, that's just insulin resistance going on in the brain. And that is causing a bunch of glucose dysregulation going on in the brain that's leading to a bunch of plaque formation and such. And then leptin and ghrelin, these are also, hormones. Again, leptin resistance, similar to insulin resistance, it's regulated by glutamate. And so we have all these metabolic, whether it's energy balance or hormone balance, neurons, these are regulated by glutamate binding to these various receptors on our cells.
Okay. All right. So bad stuff. Don't eat it. Uh, you you came up with the Reid diet, and I want to congratulate you on actually coming up with an acronym that is your name. So it'll be easier for us to kind of remember what we're trying to do here. Can you tell us what Reid stands for? And then you had 6 principles that I think are worth going through, because I think at a high level that gives us the starting point to know what the solution is for this problem.
Yeah, so READ stands for Reduced Excitatory Inflammatory Diet. And you're right, it was, last name Reid. So this is wonderful that people then can remember me. And it really is, trying to instill some, basic principles of how we're sourcing food. So excitatory is referring to the glutamate and the free amino acids that are coming from the processing of our foods. So the glutamate and being very familiar with these MSG and these very other variety of different names. Reducing inflammation, again, glutamate is associated with inflammation, and so we're trying to find ways to reduce our inflammation. I talk a lot about food, but also like we were talking about with our thoughts and thinking better thoughts and having a lifestyle where we're reducing our stress and inflammatory load. The microbiome, I do go in quite a bit. I love this whole microbiome journey that I went on, and it was, like trying to fit that into the book. I had a lot of reviewers were like, I'm not so quite sure that fits in the books. And I'm like, but it does, because a lot of our neurotransmitters are being secreted and the balance of our neurotransmitters are produced from the trillions of microbes in our gut. And so, including glutamate and the regulation of neurotransmitters and such. And so I do go through a lot in the book about, how we're feeding these trillions of microbes, making sure they're not producing a bunch of chemicals that are increasing our inflammatory load and such. And so that's, another part of when we're eating foods, we have to think about our whole ecosystem. The other principle is eating, the whole foods and sourcing, whole foods. And now I don't have the book in front of me, and I'm trying to remember the principles
All
off the
right.
top of my head here.
Yeah. So we're talking
So
about
we have,
increasing fiber was the third one. And then
yeah, and
the
that's
fourth
part of this
one.
microbiome is definitely, so I talk a lot about, making sure that when you're consuming meals, you're trying to make sure you have fat, fiber, protein, carbohydrates, and culinary herbs in every single meal so that you're not spiking glucose, you're not spiking any sort of one, nutrient component. And the fiber is really important to kind of help regulate, spikes going on or dips. Um, so the fiber was in there, yeah.
And
Of
then
herbs, I
principle
think I
four
had a
was,
bunch.
no, and then principle four was diversify.
Oh, diversity. Thank you very much. Yeah, so I talk about that a lot too because I'm like, I hear people say, well, did you see this study where, palladium was discovered in kale? And I'm like, we just have a huge issue across our planet right now where we're not sure what the soil is. We're not sure of what, potential negative toxins might be in soil. So the more that you are thinking about different geographical regions and different, farms and different plants and such, you're acquiring different minerals, nutrients, and potentially avoiding too much of one toxin, the more that you're getting diversity and variety across the diet.
And then number five, principle five was know where your food comes from and how it's made. This is actually one of my favorites because I'm a big fan. Go to the farmer's market, talk to them. They love to talk about how they're growing your food, how they're raising the animals. And when you're talking to the right one, you'll just know it. They'll just light up, and you'll have the best conversation about chickens and cows and how they're fed and how they live. And oh, check out this camera, and you're like, they got a IP address camera that they just broadcast their chickens day and night. And so there's, to me, that's my favorite one because I think when okay, they are taking care of the animals, and so this is not a situation where I have to worry about hormones or worry about the other things that are going on with the animals. Now I can focus on how it's processed, and I'm like, it's this and this. Okay, cool. Now I know this is whole food, and I'm not dealing with something else that I could be dealing with elsewhere.
It's so true. And I really didn't appreciate our farmers until I was on this journey. And it is about talking to them and finding the passionate ones that are truly out there trying to help with our food supply. And I have a very fond respect for our farmers and what they go through. And, and it's not easy. I mean, I'm living in the redwoods and just trying to grow. I couldn't feed my family to save my life right now, but it's like, if I'm just thrilled if I could get some cilantro, parsley, and basil that I can like, kind of add as an extra flavoring on my foods and such, and have a absolute appreciation. But I love talking to the variety of farmers at farmers markets, or even the neighbors who are successful with growing a lot on their gardens and what their tricks are and such, and coming up with communities of trading and bartering, like, because once your crop comes in, it's, you're usually just swamped, and it's like, okay, what can you trade for that? And I love the neighborly kind of aspect of, meeting people through, exchanging food.
And then the final one, number six, was embrace the food journey as a lifestyle.
Yeah, because I mean, there's a lot of resistance that I come across. And when I'm dealing with chronically ill, and the more ill they are, the more motivated they are potentially to change. But it's like the people that are kind of like, I'm not thriving, but I'm surviving, where the motivation is sometimes challenging to get people. So I do find that the more that people model, are feeling good, describe to other people why they're feeling good, I think that's infectious, and it's would help with, moving the needle to, a healthier population. Encouraging people to be, with recipes or whatnot, or again, instead of exchanging, food from the garden, you're exchanging like, oh, here's my homemade gluten-free, banana bread or something, where you're kind of helping inspire people to get back to the kitchen, like I say in the book, I exchanged my lab bench from in biotechnology to my kitchen counter, where that's where my experiments are now. But really being creative in the kitchen and sharing recipes and such, and we're social creatures, and a lot of these social activities are surrounded with food, and so it's great to be kind of bringing communities together and having good healthy foods while you're having a great chat.
Yeah. And the thing I'll put is, a lot of us do. We sometimes we feel we're doing okay. I'm doing okay. But I would encourage folks to really think about this. And if you just gave it like a month, just sat down and said, okay, for 1 month, I'm gonna do a little cleanup, a little you can call it elimination if you want, and you can even go and say it's a temporary thing. I think you're gonna find the clear up of brain fog, the way you feel, your energy levels, and then just clear thoughts allow you to recognize what was actually going on versus that we get fogged in. We don't realize how much we don't see. It's almost like, okay, someone who's blind or not quite blind but doesn't see well gets new glasses, and suddenly it's like, oh, that's what a bird looks like. I,
Yeah.
I
I mean,
I I equate it to that.
I didn't know what brain fog was until I didn't have it. So lived, life 40 years, didn't even know what brain fog was where until I was like, oh my goodness, my mental clarity. And then I had pollen allergies so bad, I couldn't breathe through my nose at night, just was very congested, had low grade headaches all the time. Changing my diet completely got rid of that. And you think about all these people that are just suffering with some of those things that we just define as our normal, completely gone. And I mean, that's a game changer, is being able to breathe through your
Yeah.
nose at night. Like, holy Toledo.
Yes, absolutely. And the thing is like, okay, so we start to do these things. The way this is working is now our immune system is not on alert 24/7 with this chronic inflammation through our whole body. And so now it's actually gonna now can actually focus on the stuff it should actually be fixing and not have to worry about what we fed it that's causing all of these additional problems. So we go from a multi-alarm fire to a fire department that's volunteer, can show up when it needs to solve a problem and be out of there, and that's a much better place to be.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if everybody was feeling like their lives were improved with quality and waking up in a better mood every day, I mean, wouldn't that be worth it? Even if you're not dealing with a chronic inflammatory disease at this point, or you don't think you are. Um, I mean, that's where I felt like I really was just doing it to support my daughter. And I'm like, oh my goodness, I couldn't believe the benefits that I was, like I said, breathing through my nose. Who would have thought what an improved quality of life that was alone, and getting rid of the pollen allergies and weight shed and such, and energy, my mood. Definitely. Uh, yeah, I mean, I just look at so many people who are just struggling with, not feeling good or feeling like life is getting the better of them. And it's like, in this day and age, wouldn't you want to give yourself a hand up, to be able to fight and have a better day every day?
Dr. Reid, I define wellness as being the healthiest, fittest, and happiest you can be. What are three strategies or tactics to get and stay well?
Well, of course, the foods, right? So eating whole foods, fat, fiber, protein, carbohydrates, culinary herbs in every single meal. So, the foods. I'm absolutely a big fan on the thinking better thoughts, meditation, thinking better thoughts. It's unbelievable how much stress we can cause from just our thoughts alone and such, and just kind of repeating bad memories and such. And so, the meditation of appreciation and really thinking about um, good mood thoughts is incredible with kind of uh, giving you a better day. And then I do think, nature and exercise, and if those can go together, great. If those are separate because you're going to the gym for exercise and you're doing nature for your tree hugging, I think those are also excellent for just improving mood, circulation, and your immune system. So those are my top three.
Okay. Dr. Reid, if someone wanted to learn more about you, learn more about your book, where would you like for me to send them?
So KatherineReidPhD.com is the website that has the book, link, as well as, personal consultations for people. I love looking at data and helping personalize actions for people. The book, Fat, Stress, and Sick, MSG, Processed Food, and America's Health Crisis, can be purchased on Amazon if you didn't want to go to the KatherineReidPhD.com website. And then unblindmymind.org is the nonprofit that I started to raise awareness about the glutamate in the food supply and what you can do about it. And so, and then from there, everybody has a blessed, you know, improved consciousness, elevated moods, and I can feel that. And hopefully they can feel your talk, your having me on your podcast, so that we can just improve awareness.
Excellent. Dr. Reid, thank you for being a part of 40 Plus Fitness.
Thank you so much for having me on your show.
If you enjoyed today's show, take a moment to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. And if you would, please leave us a rating and review on your podcast player of choice. Next time on the 40 Plus Fitness podcast, we bring back Jim Owen and discuss his documentaries, The Art of Aging Well and Super Agers, Getting Old, Living Young. Until then, have a happy and healthy week.